You are probably using flaps wrong if you clicked on this video. Let's solve that issue real quick. Today we are gonna be covering flaps and flaps only. I will mention energy states, I will mention lines, and if you want to know more about those topics, I highly advise you to check out my defensive flying guide and my energy flying guide, because they all tie in to this. Flaps is something that you use on top of everything else. It's very hard to portray exactly when to use it. It's very much scenario dependent and very much plane dependent. Some planes you don't want to use flaps ever, and other planes you want to basically always have them deployed. This is a matter of knowing your vehicle, which I keep hammering on about, and unfortunately that is simply the truth of this game. However, there are always some base rules, which is what I want to look at today. I want to look at merging, stall fighting, raid fighting, and some other miscellaneous stuff. I want to clarify one thing. In 95% of cases, you are using your flaps too much. If you aren't sure whether you should deploy them or not, the answer is probably that you shouldn't. Flaps are not a win button, they are a button to sacrifice your speed to get a temporary boost. With the keyword being temporary. Let's first take a look at the controls. So, you are in the hangar, you go to the hamburger on the top left, you go to controls, all very easy, you go to aircraft and you type in flaps. Now you want to make sure that you don't have only toggle flaps installed. You can do it with only toggle flaps, but this way you will only be able to toggle between whatever flap setting the game wants you to run. So you can go to landing flaps by deploying your gear first, but you can't go to takeoff. You can't go to combat until you pull the gear back in. You don't want this, you want the most amount of control. You do this by setting up different keys. So I have V for flaps down, F for flaps up, and I still have the toggle button because with some planes it's actually somewhat beneficial, because you can then kind of neuter the flaps, say with a Spitfire or a Yak 3. You don't want to use them too much, as these flaps are very much detrimental in the long run. But if you want to use just a tiny portion of the flaps, you can spam them with that key right there. Other than that, 99% of the time, you're better off using flaps up and flaps down. It's also easy to just have the ability to spam the F key sometimes throughout a fight, in case you really want to make sure your flaps are actually retracted. It's very common, I still do this sometimes myself, where people have their flaps down a little bit, they are on combat or they're only leading edge flaps. You don't see them, you don't notice them, and after like a minute of flying you actually discover that you still have your flaps down. You also of course want to turn off the auto control. You don't want the instructor to do anything for you, as 9 out of 10 times it will only grief you. So set up something that is convenient to you. I use V and F because that's what I used to use in my simulator days. If you want something else, all power to you.
Flaps actually work by decreasing or slowing down the airflow on the bottom of the wing.
Yeah, no one gives a shit. I promise you a practical guide, something that you can actually use. And I'm not about to feature some theoretical bullshit just so that I seem smart. So let's get right into it. In order to understand how flaps work, we first have to understand how these circles work. I'm gonna look at a one circle here to start off with, because it's only one and it's a little bit easier to grasp. These circles consist out of three main components. Speed in kilometers an hour, which is essentially just how fast you are going through the loop. We have the turn rate in degrees per second. There are 360 degrees in a loop, so you can do the math for yourself. And then we have the radius, which is simply how big the circle is from the middle. These three things are not working separately. They are all working together, and you can see it as a bit of a formula. If you want to maintain the same radius but increase the turn rate, then you need to increase the speed or the lift. And with the lift we can actually do something, because that's what flaps are for. Flaps increase the lift, which in turn will increase your turn rate. However, this comes at the cost of speed, because they increase the drag a tremendous amount, because they will kind of act like air brakes and they just simply make your wing bigger. So while they boost your turn rate for a little while, because it actually makes your lift higher, which makes you turn better, but this is at the expense of speed, and once you lose speed you don't have sufficient airflow to keep turning. And this is the sustained turn for the P51D30 without flaps. 326 kilometers an hour, 20.4 degrees a second, and a radius of 248 meters. Not bad. Let's take a look at it once we start using some flaps. With the combat flaps we lose 16 kilometers an hour, we lose 0.4 degrees a second, and we gain or we lose 5 meters on our radius. Now the radius is a good thing, the other two are not. Going slower will put you in a bigger disadvantage in the long term, because it also limits your ability to go vertical. The degrees a second doesn't take nearly as big of a hit. Right here it's mostly about the speed, but this has its uses because you will still decrease your radius while not sacrificing too much of the rest. If you are wondering why the radius becomes smaller, because we are turning at almost the same rate while being slower, which means that we cover less distance. This is all proportional, of course, because once we start looking at the takeoff flaps, the drag starts increasing quite significantly. We lose another 13 kilometers an hour, but we now lose a whole degree per second. And because we proportionally lose a lot more rate than speed, our radius actually increases. Takeoff flaps are basically never worth it in a dogfight, at least as long as it goes prolonged. There are some exceptions, but we will get into those in a minute here. With the landing flaps, you start seeing that we really lose some speed now. These things are virtually air brakes, and in the long term you actually go so slow that even with the increase in lift, you still get a lower degree a second. You lose another 2.3. The radius becomes pretty small because you're going so damn slow that you're covering zero distance. And I understand this is boring, so let's actually give you a bit of an example. We have the P51 D30 without flaps, and we have the Yak 3 without flaps. And you can instantly tell that the Yak 3 goes faster, turns better, and it has a smaller radius. The issue comes from using the flaps, especially in something like a raid fight. You can tell that now the Yak 3 goes slower and it rates significantly worse. It's not too much worse than the D30 and the radius is still smaller, but if you are stuck in a raid fight, eventually the D30 will outturn you because you used flaps in the Yak 3. So if you are in a plane that already outturns your enemy, using your flaps will actually hinder you and might actually end up costing you, because you don't have the energy to go vertical, you don't have the energy to complete a loop, and you're just gonna stall out in front of him. There are exceptions, but again, we will get into that in a second. Let's first look at an actual in-game example of flaps in action. We are in the same plane to really visualize what flaps do, and I'm on the 6 of Frozy. And you would think that I am winning this fight, but look what happens once we start using the flaps. You would say that with the flaps I might be able to get a shot here, and you'd be somewhat correct. You can tell that my nose starts getting closer to him very quickly, until I suddenly run out of speed, because now we are stuck in this fight. I'm going much slower and look at him pulling away. He is instantly gone. Now if I was closer to getting the shot, the flaps would definitely work there, but it's a bit of an all-in method. Now we are stuck in this position, he starts gaining on me. Because of that, I have to actually pull the flaps in a little bit and try to get my speed back up and then tap the flaps. That's another misconception that people have, that this actually works in these planes. What you have to do at this point is pull the flaps in and start rating again at your optimal speed and try to get your speed back so that you can minimize your disadvantage. The only difference between tapping your elevator and having them all the way down here is simply the rate at which you lose ground. You can tell that he's gaining quite fast. I'm gonna speed it up because, well, this is like watching paint dry. I understand it doesn't look as major as it is because he's not gaining on me super quickly, but he's still gaining on me, and at the end of the day he ends up directly behind us. Let's go a step deeper. We are gonna merge in the head-on and we are gonna actually turn into each other instead of after each other, and it's going to look a little bit like this. Now for the sake of the argument, I'm gonna make the circles overlap because it doesn't really matter if you go left, right, middle or up. At the end of the day, these two have the exact same radius and the exact same speed. The red one is gonna go counterclockwise and the blue one is gonna go clockwise. Now they are gonna overlap, so you won't be able to see them at the same time, but let's take a look at what happens if we start dropping flaps. But before that, I want to give you an example of what happens if you only cut your speed. So now we are actually gonna go a little bit slower than your opponent, and this will put you back a little bit in the loop. Why? Because you are covering less distance, therefore your enemy will kind of pass in front of you. But simply cutting throttle will do another thing that is something that you don't want. It will increase your radius because you will decrease the airflow, decrease your rate, making your loop slightly bigger. So only using your throttle is definitely beneficial, but using flaps is infinitely more efficient because it will also decrease your radius, putting you a little bit closer to your enemy and making the shot even easier because you have the ability to basically barrel stuff them directly in the cockpit. There is also an argument that the other shot is easier because you have a little bit more room to aim, which is also true, but right now I'm looking at the flaps, not so much dueling in general. So in this kind of scenario, using your flaps is more beneficial than simply cutting your throttle. However, using your flaps for too long is again in the long run going to make your raid so much worse that the enemy will actually just out energy you and pull into you anyway. But this example isn't the best, so let's take a look at the second one. This time we are going to merge in the same manner, however this time it's going to be more of a side shot view because we are going to go straight up and vertical and pulling inside of each other that way. We are also going to get rid of the perfect circles because that's not what happens, they're more spherical. But again, that's not the point of today's video. So we are going to pull inside of each other, and by doing this trajectory, what ends up happening is you're going to go head on every time you meet in the middle, just like in the previous loop. You again want to avoid this, but let's take a look at what happens if we tighten up the loop by dropping our flaps. So we will tighten up the loop, and now you can see that we are sitting inside of the head on, and we basically get a free shot. Now this time around, it's actually going to put you a little bit further away from your target because of the nature of this loop opposed to the other one. Because we are gonna travel a little bit less far, because we are losing more speed, also to the byproduct of turning harder and simply shedding more speed, we are gonna very comfortably sit inside of that loop. The issue is you are giving the enemy a major energy advantage, and if you miss this shot or if he preemptively dodges you, what he now can do is simply go vertical with his excess speed, and because you burn so much speed, you will simply not be able to follow him up and you will basically stall on his gun. So the flaps are not a free win to win any dogfight. You still need to use them sparingly because they will grief you in the long run if you overuse them. However, if you have the energy to actually follow up on this maneuver, this is actually fantastic because it allows you to tighten up the loop a little bit, giving you the shot way before he does. So if you use him sparingly to only get the position to get the first shot, to get below him for the second merge basically, you put yourself in a great position, but this does have the requirement of having enough energy or being in a better plane. In jets, this is a great tactic to get some early position in, and you can basically maintain this advantageous position until you win the fight. So you want to use them sparingly, drop them for 2 or 3 seconds, get the position, ride that position, and then maintain it by actually not burning away all your energy. Once you have the position, you don't need to overuse your flaps anymore. You already have it. By using it too much, you are actually going to make it so that you are going to be losing it in the long run because the energy discrepancy will become too big to overcome. So let's take a look at a bit of an example. We are in the Jaguar against an F5E, and the F5E will win in the long run. If I use flaps or if I don't use flaps, it doesn't really matter. But because I'm in the worst plane, I want to use my flaps a little bit more than when I'm in a better plane. Because when I'm in the worst plane, I can use the flaps to at least somewhat equalize my fighting chance. I will be on the clock, and this is not sustainable, but I can at least try to kill him in the short term. Here I'm not using flaps because I'm already slower than him, and I will be able to just kind of sit within his turning circle. So in this case, even though I'm in the worst plane and I want to equalize, I'm not in a position where I need to use it. He then starts going into a bit of a straight pull. I can follow that, and if I drop my flaps to sustain that, by the time my nose is on target, before that I will be out of energy and I will basically stall myself out. I don't want that to happen, so to maintain my position, I will drop my nose a little bit, pick up a little bit of speed, and just try to kind of sit behind him. Now he's starting to pull into us here. I'm going to cut my throttle for a little bit just to solidify the position. I'm not going to be pulling into that shot anyway, so I want to maintain a little bit of speed. And then once we are like ass to nose, I start sniffing him. I'm getting in position where I can actually pull into the shot if I use my flaps. Then I drop them, I get the angle, and then I just pull them back in to kind of conserve my speed, because otherwise he's going to end up out-turning me. Now he messed up, he dodged a little bit too much, but I hope it gets the point across. There's also the instance of being simply much faster than your enemy, which means that you have to kind of tighten up the loop if you want to get a shot, for example. And this right here is the exact same example, just portrayed a little bit differently. So we pull up over his nose, he stalls out, and if I now try to drop my nose, I will just pass under him. But by using the flaps, I will be able to just turn into his radius by tightening it up enough so that we can get the shot. It's a lot less risky when you have the energy advantage, because then you're actually able to burn a little bit of speed to get more turn in. If you have an energy advantage, you can use your flaps a little bit more than when you are at a disadvantage. Just be careful that you don't use them too much to the point where you will stall out before your enemy does. But if you go 3 times his speed, it's generally pretty safe. This right here is the exact same thing. We pull up over him, we drop the flaps, just tighten it up a little bit, and we just pull in and we shoot him out of the air. And it's really just that simple. Just be careful when your plane is actually superior in a dogfight that you don't use your flaps too much. Unless of course, and this is an absolute epic segue, we are stalling or need a bit of position. We have 2 planes basically stalling on top of each other. We've been in this situation and I want to look at this from both points of views. The first point of view, the blue one is going to use flaps. The second point of view, the red one is going to use flaps. But first I want to give you an example of what happens to only one plane, whether you are using them or not. The example that I'm going to use here is a little bit over exaggerated and it depends on the plane. Planes with a lot of engine power will behave slightly different and they will just simply be able to pull their nose up constantly, but the same principle applies, just a little bit less pronounced. We have a red line and a blue one. Let's take a look at without flaps first. You will see that you will be able to pitch up for a little bit, but you run out of speed, you run out of lift because there is no airflow. And you will start leveling out. You will start dropping your nose a little bit because your plane wants to go a bit faster in order to actually pitch up. Now, if you have a lot of engine power, you can rotate this entire picture with the red line to the top left of the screen. And if you have a little bit of engine power, it will still look the same, except it will be slanted downwards a little. What happens when we start deploying the flaps? We will increase our lift tremendously, and this makes it so that we are able to complete more of a turn. In this position, you will be a bit higher than your enemy, and at these very low speeds, this actually comes down to a very big advantage. But there's a second advantage, and that is that you are going to be much slower because you are able to fly at a lower speed without dropping your nose. Now, what does this look like in an actual combat setting? Now, look at an actual Picasso again. No flaps is gonna be at the bottom and the one with flaps is gonna be at the top. One at the top drops his flaps and is gonna be able to sit a lot higher than he already was. At the end of this time frame, he's gonna be at the end of the blue line. The red one is not gonna use his flaps. He's simply gonna fly straight underneath you, and because he's a lot faster, he will cover a lot more distance, and because he is lower than you, you are essentially able to just kind of pitch down after him, and he has overshot you. And this is why sometimes it's important to be a little bit slower than your enemy, so that your enemy can overshoot and that you can re-engage him. But I've covered this more in the defensive flying guide, and I don't want to take too much look at actual trajectories. But I will very quickly cover the gist of it. Because you have more lift, you are also able to pull a little bit more left and right, so you can wiggle a bit more, increasing the distance that you are traveling while being slower, solidifying your 6th position just that bit more. The opposite is also true, however a little bit easier to portray. Blue one is on top without its flaps and the red one has the flaps, but because the red one is on the 6th of the blue one, it becomes a little bit easier and it essentially turns into the last point where you use your flaps to get the shot. Because you use the flaps, the blue one is flying straight, and because you have a little bit more lift, you're basically able to simply pull into the guy that's in front of you. And that's the beauty of flaps. And because these drawings are absolutely terribly portraying whatever I'm trying to portray, we got the yak trees in an actual game. We got Glitch finally tell me how much the French one cost, and if you aren't sure yet, go ahead and ask him in the comments. So I'm in front of him, I drop my flaps, he does not, and he's simply gonna pull straight after me. And because I cover less distance, I go slower, and I'm able to kind of float within the Stirling circle, we instantly reverse him. And as I said with the drawings, when you are behind him, even though you are lower, if you use the flaps and he is not, you are simply gonna pull into him just like this. Now this doesn't go without saying that the flaps aren't an easy win button, you still have to use them smartly. And this right here is a perfect example. We are in the same position, I'm this time actually behind him with the flaps, I'm slightly above, I'm gonna use my flaps, I'm gonna wiggle left and right trying to get a shot on him. But in doing so I lose so much speed that I basically stall in his guns. Now if he uses his flaps here and actually shoots me, I lose the fight. Just like that. This time I'm gonna use them a little bit smarter. So I'm gonna actually pull them in. And I'm gonna make sure that I hold my positional advantage as well as my altitude. And once I get above him, I'm gonna drop the flaps yet again. And we are gonna do it properly. This time I have a position to actually use the flaps properly. I've been cutting throttle a little bit, trying to get behind him. We do a bit of a horizontal pull, trying to pull after him. Then once I get on top of him, I can simply go up and come down for the shot. Keep in mind, this is not how you dogfight properly. This is simply to showcase the flaps, and we are essentially actively throwing the fight just to show you this. So only look at the flaps, don't look at the rest of the maneuvers, as these are not the proper ones. So let's take a look at a live example of something that might actually happen in the game. The previous scenario was super niche. It's simply something I want to cover, not something you run into very often. So first we go over his nose. We try to kind of force this spiral because I know that I have more lift on my plane. He starts pulling into us, he's using his flaps to get the shot, but he's losing a lot of energy doing so. However, because he's a prop, he has a lot more energy at low speeds. I'm gonna use the flaps to try to get the shot in here, except we do no damage because we are shooting literal popcorn. Now there's two ways to handle this kind of situation. You can pull the flaps in to kind of get some energy and then pull away, but his position here was strong enough where I had to use my flaps to kind of just hang below him. He is not able to counterattack right here or stall directly on top of us, so I'm gonna keep my flaps down and just maintain my position so that I don't overshoot. Right now I just care about the position, and once I have the energy and the position, I'm gonna pull my flaps in, pick up a little bit of speed, and once I'm going fast enough, I will be able to simply pull straight into his flight path. All the planes that rate better with the flaps down have something in common, so I'm gonna look at all of these and give you 5 seconds to think about it and see if you can come up with it for yourself. We have the P39 and the P38L as well as the K, the 152H as well as the 152C, the 190, Dora, D9, 12 and 13. We have the Tempest Mark II, the Hornet Mark I, the Hornet Mark III, the Ki-84, the J2M2, and then also the PM1 Puramursky for the Swedish stack tree. What do these things have in common as I look at the biggest offender of it? All these planes rate at high speeds and they don't fall into that black hole of having no energy because they have powerful engines. The Hornet Mark III over here is a great example because it has a lot of power, but it doesn't turn that well with the clean wing. Only 18.3 degrees a second, but get a load of this. It settles in at 413 kilometers an hour, which is pretty damn high. And if you then drop all the way down to the landing flaps, it will do 20.7 degrees a second, which is a whole 2.4 degrees more, and it slows down to 285 kilometers an hour. So this is about a difference of 130 kilometers an hour with 2.4 degrees a second. And if we learned anything from today's video, this will also tighten up your radius a tremendous amount. Now, not all of these planes will rate better with the landing flaps. The P38K, for example, despite having very strong engines, still rates better on combat flaps. P38s have very efficient flaps, and not all flaps are created equal. The P38s have some of the best flaps in the game, and they are Fowler flaps, which are incredible. However, this video is long enough as it is, so if you really want to know about it, you can go ahead and Google it. As we saw today, the flaps increase your lift, making it easier to pitch up. However, what happens to pitching down? This might surprise you, it might not. Let's take a look at it. When we pitch up without the flaps, we pitch up. When we pitch down, we pitch down. However, with the flaps, a certain bias occurs. With the flaps down, when I pitch up quite a bit more violently. The opposite is, however, true for trying to go negative elevator. This is me trying to pitch down, and it won't allow me because the lift is counteracting me. So if you are engaging someone and your enemy pilot is actually trying to stay under your plane, you have to roll all the way over to follow them, or you risk essentially flying straight because you are not able to pitch down. Rolling is also hindered by the flaps as it will lower your roll rate as well. So if you are in an offensive posture, make sure to not have your flaps too low. And if you are flying defensively, abuse the fact if your enemy is using them too much. Try to stay underneath them, and if they are in a 109, with which it takes about 3 whole days to retract the flaps, you might actually be able to simply reverse him by being slightly below him. There's also the issue with flaps when you are trying to get a shot. It's basically the same thing. In this case, we are stalling out, we are pulling inside of him, but we should have retracted the flaps a little bit earlier. Because of the flaps, we were not able to put the nose down, which meant we shoot directly over him. Lastly, sometimes it's kind of important to retract your flaps a little bit early. Because if you use your flaps too much, you guessed it, you don't have any speed to complete the turn. So here we retract the flaps a little bit early, and we essentially fall directly into the shot. Lastly, it's using flaps as elevators when you don't have any tail control left. Right here we are using the flaps to give us a bit of a boost of lift, and because of this we can actually pitch up, and if we roll over we can actually pitch it down a little bit. Now this is again plane dependent, Some planes just don't have enough lift at speeds where the flaps will not rip off, and this is where it comes into play, where you can spam that button to retract and pop them out. You can see I retract them, I start leveling out again, and then when I start turning I drop the flaps, and you can tell that I actually start turning a decent amount. Now I don't want to rip them off, so I'm trying to not overspeed too much. That is the danger here. If you go too fast, you rip your flaps off, you have nothing, and if you really have nothing left, well, you are dead. It is really as simple as that. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you all for watching. If you have any questions, let me know. If it was helpful, or God forbid you actually found this entertaining, give me some support, helps me tremendously, and these videos take forever to make. Thank you all, and you'll see me in the next one.